The rain pattered against the windshield of Daniel Carter's sleek black sedan, each drop distorting the neon glow of the fast food sign ahead. Crispy King, his empire, his pride, stood before him in flickering letters, the K barely clinging to life. The irony was sharp. A multi-million-dollar chain. Yet here it was, worn, exhausted, much like the employees he was about to meet. He pulled the hood of his faded jacket tighter, glancing at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. His usual pristine suit was replaced by second-hand jeans, scuff boots, and a cap low enough to shadow his face. The expensive watch on his wrist had been swapped for a scratched-up digital one he picked up at a thrift store. He had built this company from the ground up, but tonight he was no longer the CEO. Tonight, he was just Dan Miller, a man desperate for work. The moment he stepped inside, the air thickened with the scent of grease and salt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a dull yellow tint over cracked tiles and outdated decor. He scanned the room quickly. 2 customers sat hunched over their trays, eating mechanically, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. A fryer hissed in the back. A cashier muttered something under her breath as she wrestled with a malfunctioning register. Behind the counter, a woman barely in her 30s stood with her arms crossed. Her name tag read Evelyn Brooks. She was sharp-featured, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. Her black uniform was clean, but worn at the edges, and the tight bun at the back of her head looked like it had been redone a dozen times that day. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped businesslike. Daniel cleared his throat, adopting the slightly uncertain stance of someone truly down on their luck. I saw the sign outside. Hiring for the night shift." Evelyn looked him up and down, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought she saw through him. Then she let out a breath and grabbed a clipboard from the counter. "Ever worked in fast food before?" "A while back. Been out of work for a bit, just looking for something steady." She didn't ask why. She didn't care. He respected that. "Can you start now?" It took him a second to realize she wasn't joking. "Yeah, sure." She tossed him a black apron and gestured toward the back. "Clock in and get to work. Fry station. Alex will show you." That was it. No forms, no background check. Just desperation. Daniel walked past the counter into the kitchen, where the real world of Crispy King came into view. Heat, noise, chaos. A young man, barely 20, was flipping burgers on a grease-slick grill. Another employee, a woman with tired eyes and a hairnet, was shoving a basket of fries into the oil, her hands moving on autopilot. Everything was fast, yet sluggish. Overworked, yet understaffed. "You the new guy?" A voice called out. Daniel turned to see Alex, the cashier from earlier, now leaning against the prep station with a smirk. He had the look of someone who had seen too much for his age, his apron stained, his uniform untucked, and a streak of mustard on his sleeve. "Looks like it," Daniel replied. "Fry station's yours, then." Alex tossed a pair of gloves at him. "Try not to burn the place down." The first thing Daniel noticed was the age of the equipment. The fryer's timer was busted, meaning employees had to guess when the fries were done. The oil was clearly overused, darkened from too many shifts, without a change. Every surface was slick with either grease or melted ice from the faulty freezer unit. "Does corporate know about any of this?" he asked, testing the fryer basket. Alex barked a laugh. "Corporate? Yeah, sure. They know. They just don't care." Daniel didn't respond, but the words settled heavily in his mind. As the hours passed, he absorbed everything. The unspoken hierarchy, the constant pressure, the barely concealed resentment. Employees worked like machines, but with every order that rolled in, he saw the tiny cracks, the exhaustion in Maria's movements, the way Alex clenched his jaw when a customer complained. They weren't just overworked. They were surviving. Then, just after midnight, the doors swung open, and in walked a man who changed the air in the room. Tall, sharply dressed, and carrying an aura of unearned authority, Mr. Langley entered like he owned the place. Technically, he did, regional supervisor. His eyes swept over the restaurant like a predator assessing prey. Evelyn stiffened. So did everyone else. "Brooks," Langley said, voice smooth, rehearsed. "How's our little operation running?" Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, her expression unreadable. "We're managing." Langley smiled like a shark. "That's not what I heard. Sales are slipping, labor's too high, and customers aren't exactly singing our praises." Daniel watched Evelyn's fingers tighten around the rag she was holding. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, just nodded. "We'll do better," she said. Langley sighed, as if already bored. "Cut 2 shifts this week. We need those labor costs down." Daniel felt the tension shift in the room. Maria faltered mid-step, her face going pale. Alex set down a tray a little harder than necessary. "That's already going to push people past legal shift limits," Evelyn said evenly. Langley's smile didn't falter. "Then they work harder. Or they quit." Daniel clenched his fists under the counter. For a moment, he thought Evelyn would snap. Her whole body radiated restrained fury. But then, just as quickly as it came, she swallowed it down. "Understood," she murmured. Langley gave her a condescending pat on the shoulder before turning toward the door. "Glad we're on the same page. Have a good night, everyone." Silence lingered long after he was gone. Then Alex muttered, "Asshole." Evelyn shot him a warning look, but she didn't disagree. Daniel saw it then, the trap. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was a deliberate system designed to grind them down, to wring them dry, and replace them the second they broke. He had come here looking for inefficiencies. What he found was something far worse. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter felt truly, undeniably angry. The back office was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old fryer oil. The walls were lined with paperwork, schedules, corporate notices, a faded poster about teamwork that felt more like an insult than encouragement. Evelyn sat at the desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she entered numbers into the system. Her posture was rigid, jaw tight, as though she were holding herself together by sheer will. Daniel leaned against the doorway, watching. He hadn't been working at Crispy King long, but he had already seen more than enough. He had seen Maria, after clocking out, sitting in the break room staring blankly at her untouched meal, too tired to eat. He had seen Alex pocket a handful of fries, shoving them into his mouth quickly, not because he was hungry, but because he didn't know when his next meal would come. He had seen Evelyn shove a few crumpled bills into the tip jar at the end of the night, then take them back out and divide them evenly among the workers, as if it were a secret ritual. He had spent years building this company, yet somehow it had built a system he barely recognized. "How long are you going to stand there?" Evelyn didn't look up from a screen. Daniel pushed off the doorway and stepped inside. "You ever think about leaving?" She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Every day." "So why don't you?" She finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Because people like Langley win when people like me leave." Daniel studied her, noticing the way her fingers drummed restlessly against the desk. She was exhausted, but not broken. Not yet. Outside the office, the restaurant was still running on autopilot. The hum of the fryers, the occasional beep from a register, the low murmur of workers swapping quiet complaints between orders. It was a rhythm, one Daniel was starting to recognize, not the efficient hum of a well-oiled machine, but the steady grind of people pushing themselves beyond their limits because they had no other choice. "You don't strike me as someone who follows orders," he said finally. Evelyn gave him a wry look. "I don't, but I know which fights I can win." Daniel wanted to push further, but a loud crash from the kitchen cut him off. They both moved instantly. Maria was hunched over the fryer, her hand clenched against her chest, steam rising around her. The metal basket lay on the floor, fries scattered across the greasy tile. Alex was already at her side, grabbing a towel and ice pack from the counter. Daniel stepped forward, but Evelyn beat him to it. "Let me see," she said, voice calm but firm. Maria hesitated, then uncurled her fingers to reveal an angry red burn across her palm. "That's a second-degree burn," Daniel muttered. "She needs medical attention." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I can't go to the hospital," Maria said quickly, shaking her head. I can't afford it. And if I miss work." "You're not working like this," Evelyn cut in. Maria opened her mouth to protest, but Evelyn's glare silenced her. She turned to Alex. "Take over for her." He nodded, shooting Maria a worried glance as he moved to clean up the mess. Evelyn guided Maria toward the back office, and Daniel followed, frustration mounting with every step. The silence inside the small room was heavy. Maria perched on the edge of a chair, cradling her injured hand. Evelyn knelt, carefully applying ointment from the first aid kit. "You need to take at least a few days off." Maria swallowed hard. I can't." Evelyn didn't argue. They both knew the truth. A few missed shifts meant a short paycheck. A short paycheck meant no rent, no groceries, no way to stay afloat. Daniel clenched his fists, feeling an anger that had no immediate target. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was survival. He needed to know more. That night, when the last of the customers had trickled out and the restaurant had been scrubbed down to a corporate-approved level of cleanliness, Daniel made his way to the back office again. Evelyn was there, as he expected, sorting through stacks of paperwork. She barely glanced up as he entered. "What? Why do you still work here?" he asked bluntly. Her hands stilled. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. "I was supposed to own this store," she said quietly. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What?" "I had a contract," she continued. "When I first started, corporate had this program where managers could eventually buy into their location. I put everything into it. Years of my life, every extra shift, every bit of savings I had. Then one day, they changed the policy. Fine print. Overnight, my contract was worthless. They took my investment and told me I could stay on as a salaried employee or leave with nothing." Daniel stared at her, feeling a slow, cold rage settle into his bones. "They called it a restructuring," she said bitterly. "I called it theft." "Why didn't you fight it?" Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fight who? A billion-dollar company? A team of lawyers who get paid more in a day than I'll make in a year." She shook her head. "I stayed. Not because I wanted to. Because I had to." Daniel didn't speak for a long time. He had built Crispy King from nothing, worked through long nights and early mornings to turn it into an empire. But this was something different. He had trusted the people in charge to protect what he built. Instead, they had turned it into something that chewed people up and spat them out. Langley. The name burned in his mind. Evelyn must have mistaken his silence for pity, because she suddenly straightened, her expression hardening. "I don't need sympathy," she said. "That's not what I'm offering." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "You ask too many questions for someone who just needed a paycheck." He forced a smile. "Maybe I'd just like to know who I'm working for." Evelyn didn't return the smile. Instead, she gave him a long, measured look before turning back to her paperwork. "Get some sleep, Dan." Daniel left the office, but sleep wasn't coming. He had come here looking for inefficiencies, for mismanagement, for ways to fix things from the top down. But the truth was clearer now. This wasn't a problem of broken systems. It was a problem of broken people. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if fixing Crispy King was even possible. Maybe it needed to be torn down. Daniel stood in the stockroom, his hands braced against a metal shelf, breathing in the stale scent of cardboard and fryer grease. His pulse was steady, but his mind churned. Every detail he had uncovered over the last few days stacked against him like the dented supply boxes around him. Broken promises, corporate greed, the quiet suffering of people who had no choice but to endure. He had spent years believing his company stood for opportunity, but Crispy King wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap. A burst of laughter echoed from the front of the restaurant, jolting him from his thoughts. He stepped out of the stockroom and saw Alex and Maria hunched over a clipboard near the counter. Alex was grinning, but Maria's face was tense. "Yeah, well, joke's on them. I just picked up a shift at the gas station. That way, when they cut me, at least I won't be starving." Maria shook her head. "It shouldn't have to be like this." Daniel felt something dark settle in his chest. It didn't have to be like this. Before he could say anything, the front doors swung open, and Langley strode in. The easy chatter died instantly. Employees straightened, back stiff, hands gripping whatever they were holding as if bracing for impact. Daniel stepped to the side, keeping his head down. Langley scanned the restaurant, his gaze sharp and predatory. "Brooks," he called, his voice smooth, practiced. Evelyn emerged from the office, her expression carefully neutral. "Sir." Langley sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know what kind of circus you're running here, but I just got off a call with corporate. This store is underperforming, again." A muscle in Evelyn's jaw ticked. "We're short-staffed." "You're always short-staffed." Langley smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "You don't get results with excuses." Daniel felt his hands curl into fists. "I've already told you, our equipment is failing, our team is stretched too thin, and these labor cuts are making it impossible to meet expectations." Langley tilted his head. "Then maybe it's time for new management." Silence fell over the room. Daniel saw the flicker of fury in Evelyn's eyes before she swallowed it down. Langley turned, as if the conversation was already over. Then he paused, glancing at Daniel for the first time. "You, new guy." Daniel forced himself to look up, schooling his features into something neutral. "Yeah." Langley's gaze swept over him, slow and assessing. "You like working here?" Daniel hesitated just long enough to make Langley smirk. "That's what I thought," he said. "You're all lucky to have jobs at all." Something inside Daniel snapped. "I think you're wrong." The words came out before he could stop them. The tension in the room tightened. Langley turned back slowly, one brow raised. "Excuse me." Daniel straightened. He felt Evelyn's sharp look from across the counter, but he didn't back down. "I said you're wrong. This store isn't failing because of bad management. It's failing because corporate is strangling it." Alex's eyes went wide. Maria pressed a hand over her mouth. Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "That's rich. And what exactly makes you think you know how a business runs?" Daniel took a step forward. Enough. He had seen enough, felt enough. He reached up and pulled off his cap. "I know because I built this company," he said, his voice deadly calm. Langley blinked. "What?" Daniel squared his shoulders. "I started Crispy King in a single kitchen with 3 employees and a dream. I worked the grill, scrubbed floors, stayed up all night perfecting recipes. I built it from nothing. And now I'm standing here in one of my own stores, watching the people who keep it running suffer because of people like you." The room was deathly silent. Langley's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time since he had walked in, he looked genuinely rattled. Evelyn exhaled sharply, staring at Daniel as if she were seeing him for the first time. Alex let out a stunned laugh. "You're kidding." Maria whispered, "Oh my God." Langley recovered quickly, forcing a smirk. "If this is some kind of joke, it's a bad one." Daniel pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward Langley. A corporate profile, with his face, stared back at them. Langley's face drained of color. Daniel took another step forward. "Let's talk about your performance." Langley's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder, calculating. His mind was working fast, but Daniel had the advantage now. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, thick with the quiet realization that everything had changed. Evelyn crossed her arms, her eyes locked onto Daniel with an expression he couldn't quite read. A challenge? Curiosity? Maybe both. "You think you can just walk in here and what? Fix everything?" Langley finally said, his voice sharp. "You don't understand how things work at this level. We make the hard calls so this company doesn't collapse under its own weight." Daniel's gaze hardened. "At whose expense?" Langley scoffed. "At the expense of reality. You want to play the hero? Fine. But cutting labor, reducing overhead, that's what keeps this place profitable. You don't like it? Maybe you should have been paying attention instead of pretending to be one of them." He gestured vaguely at the employees, as if they were lesser. A flicker of shame burned in Daniel's chest. Langley wasn't wrong about one thing. He hadn't been paying attention. He had spent years in boardrooms, surrounded by spreadsheets and numbers that told him what he wanted to hear. He had trusted people like Langley to make decisions in his name. And they had, at the cost of everything he believed in. Daniel took a slow breath. "You're fired." The words were quiet, but absolute. They cut through the tension like a blade. Langley laughed, short, incredulous. You can't be serious. Daniel didn't blink. I should have done it a long time ago. A flicker of panic crossed Langley's face. You don't get it, do you? The board. The board works for me, Daniel interrupted. Not the other way around. Langley's bravado wavered, and for the first time, Daniel saw the fear beneath it. The fear of a man who had built his power on the assumption that no one would challenge him. You're making a mistake, Langley hissed. Daniel stepped forward, voice steady. No. The mistake was letting people like you run this company into the ground while pretending it was success. He turned to Evelyn. You said you wanted a fight you could win. Well, here it is. She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a smirk pulled at the corner of her lips. Took you long enough. Langley stormed out without another word. The silence that followed was electric. Maria let out a shaky breath. Did that just happen? Alex grinned. Oh, it definitely happened. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His heart was still pounding, but the weight on his chest felt lighter. Then Evelyn stepped closer. So what now? Now was the hard part. He had torn down the rot, but that didn't mean the foundation was steady. Crispy King needed more than a few policy changes. It needed a complete overhaul. He thought of Maria's burn, of Alex working 2 jobs, of Evelyn pouring years of her life into something that never gave back. We start over, Daniel said. No more cutting corners at the expense of the people who keep this place running. No more suits in offices making decisions without understanding what it costs. We rebuild. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. And by we, you mean? Daniel held her gaze. I mean you. If you still want it, the store is yours. Her breath caught just for a second. The mask slipped. Hope flickered, cautious, but real. You're serious? I am. He nodded. And not just this store. I need people who understand what this company should be, not what it became. People who know what it's like to be on the ground. A slow smile spread across her face. Then you'd better prepare yourself, boss. Because I've got a lot to say. Daniel grinned. I'm counting on it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But for the first time in years, Daniel wasn't just looking at numbers. He was looking at people. And for the first time, he knew he was finally getting it right.